Hello, everybody. And today we're having a conversation with Roberta, who has been a social worker and a psychotherapist. And the thrust of our conversation is something to do with wildlife and culture, if not maybe a little bit of psychotherapy thrown in. So I'm delighted to be able to have this conversation with you on this weekend afternoon, Roberta. It's been a very, very pleasant day today. It's been very nice and sunny, and you've been gardening and I've been bird watching. So I think that actually what I would really like this to be is a sort of trip down memory lane, because in so many ways Britain has changed dramatically since the 1950s, when you were probably familiar with it, but many things remain the same, and there are sort of good things and bad things, and we're just considering what might happen in the future and how to contribute towards well, good things in the future in the context of wildlife and culture. So maybe even starting with some random questions about some of your past memories. You've lived long enough to be able to probably remember Lyon's Tea House.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, Lyon's Corner House, they used to be called sometimes.
Lyon's Corner House, and it was like a fast food restaurant of its time, was it?
Not so much of the fast, I don't think.
Right. And did they actually used to serve tea in teapots?
Tea in teapots, and cakes and scones and sandwiches and that sort of thing.
And was this tea loose tea or was it tea bags?
Oh, it was definitely loose tea.
Right.
Yes, definitely.
And was it like one of these crowded places with quite a lot of people and with a kind of bar and so a woman behind the bar, or was it more like waiters and waitresses coming?
Normally they had waitress service, and the waitresses, it was almost all women who were the waitresses in the Lyon's Corner houses. They used to have a black top and skirt and a little white frilly cap and a white frilly apron.
And were they the equivalent of modern day coffee shops, or were they bigger?
They were I think they varied in size. I think they were a bit bigger than a small coffee shop. They were more like maybe they would have, I don't know, between 10 and 20 tables, and they all had white linen tablecloths on them. They were always had tablecloths.
And did they serve tea all day long, or was it after a certain point in the afternoon? Was it like breakfasts and teas, or I mean, we don't have to go into details. Obviously, you can't remember so much, but it's just about how can we remember, like, what was that kind of modus operandi in the context of a modern day coffee shop?
Right. Well, my recall is, because I would have been a child, you see, in the 50s. So we used to go sometimes, but it would almost always be in the afternoon, and there would be tea and small cakes called fondant cakes, which had like icing, different coloured pastel icing on them, with perhaps a little cherry on the top or something. There were often scones, which you'd have with cream and jam, and sometimes sandwiches, and they were always like small, with the crusts cut off, so small white sandwiches, and quite often on a like a cake stand with different layers, like people have afternoon teas these days. A bit like that, really.
Yes, I mean, that kind of thing is actually regarded as rather than expensive treat in the modern day world, but it must have been commonplace at that time. So this is also a time associated with steam trains. So you must have done quite a bit of traveling in steam trains. Is that the case?
Yes, I mean, my first memory is the house that I was brought up in, the first house I lived in, which I lived in till I was we moved the day before my 5th birthday. So my early years, we lived very near the Great North Great Northern Line. So the line that goes off up the east coast of England, right up to Scotland.
Yes.
And a special treat for us was to walk to the bridge and watch the Flying Scotsman go underneath. And as it went past, you were covered with smoke and soot and it went very fast. But so I was probably only 3 or 4 when I can remember that. So that was my first memory of a train, and my father was in the Home Guard, and he used to guard the tunnel at Welwyn North Station. So he was in the Home Guard then. But traveling by train, I remember when I was probably 7 or 8, and we used to go to London by train, and this was quite an expedition. And standing on the station, there used to be a machine where you could print out your name or something in metal. Yeah, I think it must have been zinc or something like that, and you had to turn this arrow to the letter you wanted, and then pull a lever, and it would punch this embossed label, and then at the end you pulled another lever and it cut it off. So we always did that when we were waiting for the train, or sometimes my mother wanted us to do plant labels, so we used to do that. But when we got on the train, and sometimes the trains didn't have corridors, so they opened straight onto the platform. So it's called a compartment. So you just went in the compartment and there was no access. There were only access doors to the outside. So you couldn't walk along or go to the toilet or anything like that. So you had these compartments which probably could have sat 8 or maybe 10, maybe 8 people. And to get out, there was no handle on the inside. You had to let the window down with the leather strap, and it had holes in it. So, and the holes were, there was a little knob, and when you pulled it up, you had to hook the leather strap onto this hole. So when it actually came down, you had to lean out of the window and undo the door from the outside to get out.
Oh, right. Yes.
Yeah. So yes, and the other thing I remember about them was the smell of them, because they really smelled of smoke and soot from the engine. They were very, very dirty, and I'm just aware my partner's cutting the grass. Is it okay?
No, I can't hear anything. It's fine.
You can't. Okay.
No.
Yes. So the other thing about them was that there was quite a lot of wood in them, and they had these suitcase racks along the top, which were like fishing net, and you put the bags in there.
Yes.
And they also all had little posters on advertising various spots where you could go to on the train. So there would be places like Brighton or London or Skegness or whatever.
So one understands that you were growing up probably in Hertfordshire, like northern Hertfordshire, or somewhere like Welwyn area, maybe.
Yes, that sort of area.
Yes. And so at that time, the idea was that how did you get from your home to the train station? Were there like cabs or taxis, or did people normally walk? Presumably, most of the time they walked.
Well, we lived it was a good couple of miles from the train station, and we did have a car. We had a car when I was about 3, so I think we were very lucky. Not a lot of people had one at that point. And so we used to take our car to the station and leave it at the station.
But presumably there would have been transport services that connected up people's homes and the station, such as autobuses or I don't know, taxis or something like that.
I think there were occasional buses, but it was quite a small village. So they didn't run very often. So I don't know. I mean, I suppose we could have walked to the station. It was probably 2 or 3 miles to the station from our house, and we used to walk a lot in those days. You know, people did.
Yeah.
So, but I recall us, you know, getting in our car, which was a Ford. What was it? It was some sort of Ford.
Yes.
I can remember the number plate, which was ORO406.
Okay. So at that time, of course, that you didn't have the motorways, and the roads would have been much smaller,
Yeah.
much narrower, and there would have been more winding. They would have been having a more of a winding quality with lots of vegetation around. Maybe the
Yes.
horizons weren't quite so sweeping.
Yes. Definitely the roads were smaller and narrower, and very little traffic on them as well. I mean, you probably, in a couple of miles around us, you probably only see 1 or 2 cars in, you know, an hour or so. It was just much quieter. The roads were much quieter, and the hedges were there were more hedges. I mean, that's one of the things that really noticeable now, that when you walk around the fields, that the fields are very big and have a lot of crops, and they use a lot of machinery. In those days, they were very small, the fields, and it was a lot of it was harvested, you know, with a tractor, you know, just a tractor and something that cut the corn or the wheat.
Yes, and there would have been probably lots of horses mulling around and doing lots of work and pulling things around at that time, would you say?
No, that was really before. It was more like old-fashioned sort of tractors. They didn't have cabs on them at all. So when it rained, people got wet. You know, the workers got wet.
Yes.
No, horses were more my parents' generation than my generation. I think tractors were quite common from about I don't know, the 1920s. I think probably.
Right. Yes.
So,
Yes.
yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
you must have had lots of cultural influences on your life while growing up. So I'm just going to kind of like think about, I mean, I just want to think about the sorts of books that you were reading most of the time that come to your head. Children's books that maybe that we might be familiar with today as well in terms of authors.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. So my very first memory is I had Beatrix Potter books.
Yes.
And read them, and I particularly loved them because my grandfather lived in the Lake District, so I was very familiar with the kind of scenery that she included in her pictures. So that felt very that was quite a home, you know, a homey thing for me to actually read these books and know the landscape. So that was one author, that sort of very early author that I remember. I also loved, when I was growing up, Arthur Ransom books. So
Yeah.
Swallows and Amazons, and all that series. So,
yes.
And again, they're set in the Lake District, which was kind of familiar to me.
What about influences like Enid Blyton or Richmond Crompton or others that we might have heard about?
Yes, well, when I was in the 50s, Enid Blyton was very much a no-no. She was very she was somebody that parents, I don't know, that libraries didn't have her books at all. Because but I mean, I did read some. There was a series called the Adventure series, and I read quite a lot of those and enjoyed them. And because my parents, like, they just let me read anything I wanted, really. And I can remember going to the library. We used the library. We had library even in our little village. We had a library that was there all the time. And we used to use that a lot. and I used to go, but I can remember crying because I wanted to read Black Beauty, and they didn't have it. So
Oh,
they didn't have it in at the time. So I was very upset because I was really into horses at the time when I was younger.
right.
So yes, I can remember being very upset about that.
Well, these libraries would have been a tremendous blessing. I mean, libraries were very big in this country until relatively recently. So they would have been quite a big blessing and part of your life,
Mm.
maybe. Yes, yes,
Yes, yes, and they were always very, very quiet. You couldn't talk in them at all. It was really, you know, if you wanted a book, you had to go to the librarian and you had to whisper to her what you
yes,
wanted.
yes,
You couldn't talk. It was very much not done to talk in a library. And there
yes,
was always an area where you could sit and read if you wanted to, which is also very good.
yes. And did you have to go to church on a Sunday?
No,
All right.
no, my parents were not religious. However, I did. I lived in this village, and I was kind of curious about what people did in church. So I used to go on my own when I was about 7. I used to go and sit in the back of the
Yeah,
church,
yeah,
and I didn't know what was going on. But
yeah,
I think for some reason I kind of wanted to find out. I did have friends who were whose parents went to church, and they went to Sunday school. And if I went to stay with them, and I'm talking about when I was under 10, I used to go to Sunday school with them, and I can remember being very envious. They had a little book, and they used to get these stick-on stamps when they went to Sunday school, so they used to put them in the book and collect them. And I think they got something when they'd
yeah.
been enough times. I don't know what exactly.
Yeah, but Roberta, in your school, I mean, these Church of England or traditional English schools in those days, there must have been a religious assembly, and you might have
Yeah.
had some kind of prayer service before you had your lunch.
Yes, we did have it would have been Church of England. It wasn't a church school, but we did have every morning we did have a hymn
Yes,
and a prayer, I think. And we did say grace before lunch.
yes,
Um,
yes,
something. So, you know, we used to sing things like "All Things Bright and Beautiful" and "Jerusalem" and
yes, yes,
I can't remember. I can't really remember.
yes. Now, I just want to steer the conversation towards your kind of like college or university. Did you study anything in any of these institutes?
I studied social work, yeah, at Bristol University.
Yes, yes. So you had to spend some time at Bristol. That would have been quite a thriving city at the time, because it still is, isn't it, actually?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, it was.
yeah,
Yes,
yes.
but I didn't like living in the city, so I lived there for a little while. But then I moved to a place in the countryside, which was suited me much better.
And you were traveling to the university from
Yes,
that town in the
yeah,
countryside. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So now the thing is that everybody starts complaining about lots and lots of ills of the world on the 60s. 60s are seen as a kind of permissive time, something when things started breaking down, something of the old order started breaking down. Can you confirm this? Or alternatively, would you say that it was simply a continuation of things that had been evolving from the 50s? I mean, I was once speaking to one of my teachers, and he said, oh, you just got to blame the 50s for that. And then if you want to start complaining about the 50s, you've got to blame the 40s for that. So you could sort of do it like that. Alternatively, you could say that the 60s was quite revolutionary. How's your perspective?
Yes. I think there was a big change. I think the post-war period was a big change. I mean, when I was certainly before I was 5, there was still rationing. So we still had ration books and sweets were rationed still. So I think what happened was when when things started to change a lot after the war, and we had the National Health Service came in 48, and you know, things were really, really changing, and there was a lot of housing built and so on, and people's lives changed hugely in the 50s. And I think it was just a development of that, really, that people had more time to you know, to do things that, you know, if you think about, they have more ability to move around. There was almost full employment in the 60s. I mean, certainly when I left school, there wasn't any problem ever getting a job. You could always get a job. So I think that gave a different flavour to the way people lived and appreciated their freedom. And, you know, and things were changing for women as well, because there are a lot more mechanical help in the house, because, you know, certainly in the 50s, it was very unusual to have much in the way of, I mean, my parents were quite well off, so we did have a washing machine, but it wasn't an automatic washing machine like we have now. It was like a twin tub, and you had to be there and move the stuff from the washing machine to the spin dryer. And you know, there were sort of vacuum cleaners were starting to come in and that sort of thing. So I think women were freed up quite a lot from you know, really full-on housework when it was actually a full-time job, and started to look outside the home. So all sorts of things came into us being able to live life in a different way, I think.
Now,
I think
yes, I want to ask you briefly about the influence of the British Empire, because although you kind of get the impression that people weren't influenced by the British Empire, ironically, at the time that the empire was more alive than it is now. Like if you looked at your average breakfast table, you could be having X coming from Australia, Y coming from Ceylon, Z coming from Africa. Do you have any recollections of any kind of empire inputs from that context?
As far as what we ate?
Well, yes, or what people were buying, and you know, things like textiles and linen, and where things were manufactured. Can you remember any kind of connection with the kind of empire, or as it were, the globalized world at the time?
I think one of the things was that there are a lot of things that we have now that we had very sparingly then.
Okay.
For example, oranges were quite it was unusual to have oranges. They were not something that was you know, there was a special treat. Bananas we always had, because they came on boats, I think, and they came, you know, they came all year.
Yes, maybe from the Caribbean. Yes, maybe from the Caribbean. Yes. Yeah,
that was my memory. I mean, I think we kind of were aware that tea came from Ceylon, or from India as well. But coffee, we didn't have at all. I mean, we didn't have coffee bean. My mother used to go to London once a week, because we live quite near London, and she used to go to Soho, and she used to buy coffee bean. That's one of the things she bought when she went to Soho. She went and bought coffee beans, and she used to grind her own coffee and make that. But that's not something you could buy locally. You couldn't buy things like spaghetti locally. You couldn't buy you know, cheeses and things. And we only had English vegetables, really, or things in tins, because there wasn't any frozen goods. So it was a very different diet in some, much more local.
So, like, for example, you must have had potatoes and bread from Britain, as well as meat and sausages and bacon and eggs, that kind of stuff, all local produce. Yes. And presumably you did have like kippers for breakfast, like fish and things like that.
Yes.
From locally sourced. Yes.
Yeah. And yes, and of course we did have, I mean, we all grew quite a lot of our own food, but things like strawberries, we'd only have those ever for a month or so in the summer, not only because they weren't available any other time of year, but also because now they grow so many different varieties and they lengthen out the season much more, but then they didn't. So I mean, they were a real treat because tinned strawberries do not taste like fresh strawberries at all.
No.
So those sort of soft fruits were very, very seasonal, and you know, the things like apples that obviously keep all year anyway. So that wasn't such a you know, that we had apples all year, but a lot of food was very seasonal. The sort of thing that actually people kind of want to get back to a bit now, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And did you go to the pictures much, like we're talking 50s or whatever? Did you go to the pictures? Was that a regular occurrence, going to the pictures?
No.
No.
No. We had a small cinema in where I lived, but we didn't really go to the cinema. There were I can remember once going to see a film. It was a film about Africa and lions and things like that. I can't remember what it was called now, but it was very exciting. I remember it being a very exciting experience. We actually went, because we're near London, we tended to go to the theatre more than the cinema, because we would go to, and we'd go see the ballet and things like that. So that, I mean, but that wasn't like, it wasn't regular. It was maybe once a year, twice a year,
Yes.
as a special treat, you know, for Christmas or something, or birthday.
What about any kind of international travel? Maybe, obviously, it was probably more limited then, but maybe you must have at least taken ferries to France, or maybe taken boat trips to certain parts of the UK as well.
Yeah, when I was very young, we went to Cornwall, and we went on the train, and my brother was still a baby, and we had to take you know, a proper big cot for him. So we had to be helped. We had a porter to help us on the train with it, and
Yes.
I can't imagine how difficult it must have been. So that's what people did in those days. They took their own cot, and because you had porters helping you on and off, and a guards van where you could put everything in. Used to do that. I remember we did go to Mallorca a long while before package holidays ever happened. We went to Mallorca. We went by plane, and I would have been about 7, I think, 6 or 7, and we stayed in this hotel, and there only was salt water coming out the taps to wash with. They didn't have any fresh water to wash with. So that was quite an experience, really, and it was very different. I can remember being quite taken with the way they were farming. Even at that age, I was really interested in the fact they were still using donkeys to do, you know, ploughing and things like that.
Yes. So you studied social work, and obviously you must have had quite a strong motivation to pursue that line of work. But at a certain point, while you were in the middle of your mainstream life, you must have had developed some kind of relationship with the environment in some way. I mean, either you were a gardener, or you liked the countryside, or you studied, you were an amateur naturalist. Would you say that you had any or maybe you became aware of some of the things that were changing in Britain, that either things you appreciated or things you didn't appreciate? So anything about the awareness of what was happening to the environment, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I look back now, there have been huge changes, and I mean, one of the things when I was growing up, there were lots of birds of prey about, kestrels and and other birds as well. Thrushes particularly. I mean, there were always thrushes in our garden, always. And
You mean like song thrushes?
Song thrushes, yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And really don't have, well, we don't have them around where we are, and you don't see them in the same way. And herons as well. There all seem to be a lot of herons around. Not that we lived anywhere where there were big lakes or anything, but they just used to be around. So a lot of the birds that grey wagtails,
Yes.
things that maybe are not so common now.
Well, certainly thrushes are very rare now. Thrushes and sparrows are a lot less than they used to be. So many bird species have declined, although certain things like herons are still found.
Yeah, because we had a river near our garden, so we used to have kingfishers as well, which you don't see those. You hardly ever see those now.
No, you hardly ever see them. No. But I mean, obviously, things like the motorways were opening up. The motorway network started in the 60s. You probably didn't have any strong opinions or views about them at that time. But in many ways, lives for people became easier and easier, didn't they? Or they seem to be getting easier.
Yeah, I can remember because the motorway, the A1M motorway runs quite close to where we used to live now. I can remember it being built.
Yes.
And I had friends of my parents, and we used to call them Uncle and Auntie. And Uncle Tom had a little sports car, and when the motorway opened, he took me in his sports car and did 100 miles an hour up the motorway, which you're allowed to do in those days.
Yes. And just for information, I mean, until the regulations came in, isn't it the case that in the 50s, I don't know about the 60s, but in the 50s, people were horning on the roads quite a lot?
Oh, I don't remember.
Okay. So you can't remember that people were horning quite a lot, because this is something I noticed in films, that when people become impatient, they're horning constantly. And at a certain point, maybe they brought rules against that.
Yes, or maybe I just didn't live somewhere where there was a lot of traffic, really.
Yes.
So,
and can you remember when steam engines were disposed of and replaced by diesel or something better?
I think that it must have been in the 60s, I think.
Yes.
I'm not sure exactly when, but there was a big thing with Dick Beeching when he closed a lot of the the smaller lines.
Can you remember about the impact of that? Did that affect you in any way? Were there any campaigns or people complaining about it or anything like that with these train lines being cut?
I think people were generally very unhappy about it, but I think that they felt that they couldn't run the services, and people, of course, were using cars more and more. So it's a bit like the country buses these days, that people weren't using them, so using the services. So they were lost, which is such a shame.
Yes, and what about trams? Do you remember trams in cities? Can you maybe it doesn't go?
Not really, because I didn't really live, in a city where there were trams at all. I think trams went out in London before the 50s. I think they were more 30s, 40s, 20s.
Yes. So I think that, I mean, like, it's very, very difficult to generalize, but the 70s and 80s were Britain was developing tremendously during the 70s and the 80s. I know that there were also like areas of like economic depression and gloom. I mean, we hear quite a lot about it, but overall there has been lots and lots of economic development. But then from the 90s, people are becoming more and more aware of what's happening to the environment and how things have changed. And how much of a loss do you see in terms of the in terms of the nature of the British countryside? I think that some of it is still there. Lots of it is still there. Unfortunately, this country has got very strong planning regulations that stops unconstrained development. But there seems to be, I mean, I'm very happy to see that there seems to be a movement now for things like rewilding. What are the sorts of things you miss from the countryside, from how you might have been familiar with it?
Yes, I think, yes, I tell you, I can tell you one thing that I really miss, and that's the hay fields, because they were always full of flowers, and you really don't see that unless, you know, somebody has done a wild meadow. The meadows that we had then were superb. They were always full of poppies and other wildflowers. And one of the other things which was always really lovely was that they had proper haystacks, you know, and they were thatched on top. And rather than storing the hay in a barn, they were always outside, and usually beautifully done, you know. The bales, they were all piled up, and then they thatched over the top to keep them dry. So that to me was kind of iconic English countryside, with the hedges and the fields. And of course we used to have pigs were always in the fields. They weren't shut up. They always were in. They were always free range, and the hens were always free range. So a lot of the food production was very. It was very obvious where our food was coming from, in a way that perhaps it isn't so obvious today. And so, you know, and I think people were closer to the land. I mean, it's very difficult, because obviously if you grew up in London, you wouldn't know about all that. But living in the country in the 50s and 60s, I think you were very aware of where the, you know, we used to take, like if we had windfall apples in the garden, we used to take them up and give them to the pigs on the pig farm, you know.
Yes. The thing is that obviously you must have also grown up at a time when there were lots of different shops rather than supermarkets. Maybe you appreciate how small shops gave way to supermarkets, and what are the negative aspects of the supermarkets, if any?
I mean, certainly in the village I grew up, it wasn't a big village, but we had everything to support life there. So we would, and my mother used to shop every day. So most people shopped every day, and she would go around the village, and she would go into each shop in turn, and the shops would only keep what they kept. So if you went in a grocer's shop, there was a long mahogany counter, and you could buy like just a couple of spoonfuls of sugar or a great big bag. And she used to buy salt in blocks. So it used to come in blocks, and we used to have to roll it out with a rolling pin to make it. But in the grocery shops, you would have cheese and bacon, and it was always sliced off the piece of bacon, so you could ask for it very thinly sliced or thick sliced.
Can you remember anything about the wrapping? I mean, these days everything is done in plastic. And I also wanted to just for my own curiosity, I don't really know if you remember, once upon a time there were shops called Lipton's grocery shops, but probably you're probably too young to remember Lipton's grocery shops.
No, I don't remember that. But they used to sell tea. I mean, tea used to be in the grocery shop, and they used to have like a scoop and put it in it was loose tea, and they put it in a little bag. Very little was ready packed. It was all scooped out of a big bag, like rice or sugar would be scooped into a bag, and then they would seal it up, weigh out what you wanted, seal it up.
What kinds of wrapping did they use? Did they use newspaper?
Okay, well,
container
the sugar always used to come in blue sugar paper bags. They call it sugar paper.
Yes.
Still use it in schools and nurseries for painting on.
Yes.
Things like bacon were usually wrapped in wax paper.
Yes.
Have wax paper. Often things like nearly always paper bags or wax paper. But
yes.
The butcher wouldn't sell. They never sold any cooked meat or anything but proper meat.
Yes. Yes.
Raw meat.
Yes.
And they always used to wrap it, but there always was a woman, usually a woman, it was always a woman actually, in a little cabinet, glass cupboard. So the butcher never took money. So there was no, it's about cost effection. I guess I don't know. But he used to shout to the woman in this little office bit, what all the cost was, and then she used to add it up and used to pay her. And then he'd wrap your meat in wax paper and you'd take it away. And there was even in our small village, we'd have a wet fish shop. And also greengrocers. Now they didn't used to wrap anything, only very delicate things like mushrooms. So my mother had a dirty bag and a clean bag. So she used to go around with her dirty bag, and they put potatoes in first, just loose, then carrot, weigh them out, put them straight in, and then on top they might put a cabbage or cauliflower or something like that, and then or apples, cooking apples. But anything like if they had mushrooms or something like that, they put those in a paper bag and they put those on top. But yes, so that was a very normal thing that people those days had, two shopping bags, and for the dirty goods and the clean goods.
Did you start missing locally produced fish, or since there were so many things replacing locally produced fish, things like farmed salmon and foreign sorts of fish like tuna and stuff, did you find that it kind of went over your head?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I don't ever remember we used to have pink. There used to be tinned salmon, and it was horrible. It was like really pink and not very nice at all. And it always had horrible bones in it as well. I seem to remember. I used to hate bones when I was a child. Yes, but the fresh fish, it's very different now. You have to go to a proper fishmonger, and they're not very common. I mean, here where I live now, it's quite a big town, and the only fishmonger is in the market. So it's not easy to get proper fresh fish nowadays. I mean, they do have it in Sainsbury's, but it's not the same really.
So you must have noticed certain trends happening in society through the kind of work you were doing as a social worker and as a psychotherapist. You must have seen certain sorts of problems and issues coming up with either your clients or your patients or whoever you were dealing with that were different from the past. So can you see a transition in people's mental issues that suggest the sorts of changes that are taking place at a global level? I mean, that suggests some kind of malaise. What do you have you noticed any trends in people's mental issues that you have to deal with?
Well, I think I think people always have problems, always have done, always will do. But I think what happened in the 50s was that it was something to that there was a lot of shame around mental health. I think people ignored it, or perhaps parents, if they had a child or they had a grown-up child with mental health problems, they would hide them away. And certainly when I was early on, when I was a social worker, I was involved in helping people get back from these big psychiatric hospitals back into the community. And some people have been there for years and years and years. And so that certainly it's a big change, that people are more they're more accepted, and it's more acceptable for people to say they're depressed, to say that they're anxious and all that sort of thing. So I don't really know if there's been a huge change, or whether it's just that we are actually more open about what's going on.
Yes, I mean the things, some of the things that have changed could be things like actually I've just slipped a certain thread of my thought, but loneliness, for example, has been increasing as of late. More and more people now are supposed to be lonely than ever before. This is not always a bad thing. Some people are quite happy being alone, but like in the context of social work in the good old days, as it were, there might have been lots of social networks, natural social networks, which supported people like neighbors and friends and relations, but that would have got less and less, and more people have to rely on the state or a few friends to support them. Is that the case, would you say?
I think that there was a big change because people started moving around more. People left where they were brought up and where their families were, and started moving to different areas to work, to study, and then they didn't go back. So I think for a lot of people there were all sorts of reasons why they didn't really, and I think a lot of people didn't know how to build those contacts, I think, and I think that's still very true. I think where I live now, I've lived here for 12 years now, and maybe a bit more, and I still don't feel that I'm really part of this community, because I wasn't born here. I wasn't, I didn't grow up here. I didn't go to school here. And I think that's true of an awful lot of people. So I think it is a very different way of life than there was in the 40s. Very different.
Yes. Do you feel that this country is still as influential as it used to be, or do you feel that somehow? How do you feel about Britain's place in the world as a force for good? I mean, I know that that's a very broad question, and I don't expect you to give me a kind of opinion about it. But what I'm trying to ask is, lots of people say that people are now richer than ever before, and many people are always agitating to get things done, either locally or at a global level. So in this context, do you think that Britain remains an influential country, at least in the context of the English language and the fact that so many people around the world speak it, and also that this country has got lots of immigrants, and we are connected to the world through diplomacy and through immigration?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, that. I think we'd like to think that we were still important.
Yeah.
I don't really know how. I don't really know how that is. I don't know. I think my feeling is that yes, there are some people who are very much better off than they were, but there are also some people who are very much worse off than they were.
Yes.
in all sorts of ways. And I think it's a very, very complex question, and I don't really feel that I'm kind of in a place where I could even answer that. But because I think there's so many issues and so many complexities about the world, and it's just this thing about always being available, or communication, that I think, when I was young, we didn't have mobile phones. So I was talking to somebody about this recently, and when I was first a social worker, I used to go and do visits. I didn't have a mobile phone. I didn't have a way of getting in touch if there was a problem. We didn't, and as teenagers, we always used to have to make sure we had some money, some cash, so that we could phone home. And your friends never let you down, because they always turned up. You'd think there was something really wrong if people didn't. You made an arrangement and people didn't turn up. They didn't. Nowadays people think nothing of making an arrangement and then changing it half an hour before or whatever. But because we didn't have that option, people were much more respectful of other people, and because people, your friends, if you didn't show up, you'd arrange to meet your friends, say to go to the cinema or something as a teenager, and you didn't show up, your friends would be really worried about you. They would be really worried. I mean, because that's not something that we did,
So this is probably tied to the issue of loneliness that we raised, that in the modern day world, in some ways people are a little bit more lonely, because that kind of natural network of trusting in other people and knowing your neighbors and understanding about how the network will support you. Today, it's a kind of more of an internet-based network, or an electronics-based network that might be far removed from home.
Yes, but I also really appreciate, something like this wouldn't happen, would it? That you're in London, I'm in Shropshire, and we can see each other. We're talking to each other, and that in some ways it's an absolutely marvelous benefit. But when I see a young mum pushing her child along and speaking to a phone, I just think, what is that child's going to grow up thinking? And they're talking to their mother and she's on the phone, and I just think that child is going to grow up not thinking that a phone is more important than a human being, and I just think that's a very dangerous place to be. And I'm not saying that all mothers are like that, of course not, but that's what I observe when I'm in town over and over again, and I just think how sad.
Yes. So recently you have been reading a book about rewilding, and I'm just wondering if this is something you're interested in promoting for this country, or rather, would you like to see this country having a bit more of that wilderness coming back? Would you like to see a scaling back of the motorways and a improved public transport system, that sort of thing? What kinds of changes would you like to see?
Well, I certainly think that having kind of edges around the fields where you're allowing more wildlife to exist, not farming right up to the edges of fields, leaving strips of wild land here and there, can only be good. I mean, I think, and I think, all the little things that people have started to do to encourage wildlife into their gardens, it's great. I think it's really important. We don't all have 70 odd acres to rewild, but we do have a little corner, and like putting a little pond in your garden can make a huge difference to what comes to visit.
Do you have a pond, may I ask now?
Yes.
Great. And what about things like turtle doves and possibly
Yeah.
reintroducing like a few more wild animals like beavers. And do you have any opinions about things like beavers, wolves, lynxes? Like maybe when you were little, you used to have like lots of rabbit pie, but rabbits and things are so rare now. And any thoughts
Yeah.
about, you know?
They're not rare around here. um, yeah. Yeah, I could never eat rabbit as a child.
Oh,
Too, too,
were you served it up when you were a child? Quite a lot of rabbit. Yeah.
yes, sometimes we used to have rabbit.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
not
Yeah.
often, but sometimes we did. But yes, I couldn't eat it. I couldn't, because to me rabbits were something out of Beatrix
Yes. Yes.
Potter, I think, fluffy and beautiful.
I mean, would you say that you have noticed the way that what about your relationship with public transport? Would you like to see a better public transport system? And do you think that the car has got too much? Or do you think that the car has, I mean, I don't really want to start becoming negative about the car, but do you think that you miss something of that public transport network that you used to enjoy when you were young? Talking about the sort of trains
I
you used
think,
to travel on.
yes. I mean, it's hard. I mean, we've got rid of one of our cars now, so we only have one car, and it would be very handy for us to have more public transport available because
Yes.
of where we live, because we
Yes.
can't, we live in the country, and there is a bus service, but it's quite a walk to it, and then they don't run very often, and so on. I think it would be wonderful if we had more public transport for everybody,
Yes.
not only for the environment but for individuals as well. And it's a very difficult thing to get the right balance, because again, if I do use the public transport, hardly anybody on the buses, so
Yes.
it's a very difficult thing to get right, I think.
Yes.
And yeah, I mean, it feels as though that it might be really helpful if there was a drive to bring down the cost of electric vehicles. That would be very helpful, and to make the towns more pedestrian friendly, because there's still a lot of traffic in towns which probably doesn't need to be there.
Yes. Yes. Well, there are signs of this happening. There are signs of
Yeah.
improved public transport and
Yes.
more pedestrianization.
Yeah.
But
I'm delighted.
yes.
I'm delighted that last night I read our local parish newspaper, or it's just like a little A4 thing, and they're actually planning to make a cycle route from near where we are right into the centre of Shrewsbury town. So this would be for cyclists, for people with pushchairs, for people walking, and that sort of enterprise is just really important, I think. Shrewsbury is quite connected. It's in itself, lots of cycle tracks, but to get into Shrewsbury, it's not so easy, and the roads are so awful. I mean, I would cycle. If I can't cycle on the road, there's narrow roads, and the traffic is fast, and they're big lorries, and I just don't think it's safe. But I would cycle on a cycle track into town. It's only 5 miles. It's not far.
Yes, and I just like to ask, as kind of like moving towards the close of our conversation, in how you shop when you're doing your supermarket shopping. Do you try to buy things conscious of local produce versus international produce? Do you try to buy things in a way that you think might be more ethical, one way or another, or biodiversity friendly? And also, what about the produce from your garden? What do you grow in your garden, and have you been enjoying the fruits from your garden, as it were?
Yes. Okay. So before lockdown, we were shopping in the supermarket maybe once a month, and then in the local market in Shrewsbury, I'd go once a week to that. So and we have a milkman.
Yes.
So we have a milkman who brings milk and orange juice and something else, skim milk as well, that I use. You know, and then we wash the bottles out, and then he takes them away and fills them up again.
Yes,
You know,
yes.
so that's very, very good. I actually wrote to Sainsbury's to ask them. I thought this is a brilliant idea, to ask them if they would put all the produce that came from the UK into one section, so that I could shop more easily, rather than looking at every package to see where it comes from. Because I try not to buy stuff that has been flown in, or I try to buy stuff that is, you know, from Holland rather than from Peru, that sort of thing. But it's very hard work, and also to ask them to reduce the plastic packaging, which is not necessary for a lot of things, you know. But it does feel a bit like banging your head against a brick wall.
Yes. Well, you can vote with your feet, can't you?
Yes, but you know, I do, but it's not that easy. In the garden, we have apples, we have pears, we have. I always grow salad stuff, cucumbers, tomatoes, spinach, kale. What else do I have? Runner beans, celery. You know, quite a lot of things. But of course, you know, it's not all year round. Mostly in the summer.
Yes. Do you have like a local dairy produce so that you can source things like butter and milk? You probably do get it.
Well, I get the milk from the milkman.
Yes.
And butter depends. There's a farm shop I go to quite a lot, but I don't always get it there because it's very expensive.
Yes.
But you know, it's about balancing things, isn't it? You know, we have to be realistic about the cost of things. Like if I'm buying toilet rolls, I'll always buy the ones that are wrapped in paper, not the ones that are wrapped in plastic. And it's that sort of thing that, you know,
you might value a system, mightn't you, where you can give back bottles and get a new bottle rather than to constantly throw away plastic bottles.
Yeah, well, I don't buy plastic bottles because glass bottles can be recycled even if they can't be refilled. So that's what I do.
And maybe when you were small, was there some kind of deposit scheme to return bottles and to? Yeah. So that existed when you were young.
Yes, when you know, things like lemonade or bottles, you as a child you would it would be like a way you could earn some pocket money. You get people's bottles and take them back to the shop.
Yes, and you probably also notice a proliferation of food waste. Increasingly today, we are being asked. Well, I mean, there has been a rise of food waste, whereas in the past some of it was recycled to feed animals. And they hardly seem to use scraps for feeding animals anymore. So I mean, this is something I'm interested in, by the way. I think that, I mean, at least, I just wanted to also query you. I don't necessarily think that you would, I mean, I just want to work out, you probably agree that veganism, being a pure vegan would be quite difficult living in Britain, or do you have you know, I mean, do you think that veganism is a bit rich, if you know what I mean? Because you're relying on lots and lots of foreign produce.
I think again, it's one of these things that you balance. I'm not a vegan. I'm not a vegetarian. I eat fish and I eat some chicken, but I always eat meat which is free range and organic. I don't eat much, but I do like to have that. And I think it's very important for people to learn to moderate what they buy, so there's no waste. We have no waste. We never waste anything.
Right.
If I cook something and we leave it, we'll have it the next day for lunch or something. We don't throw stuff away. We have a compost heap, so any peelings and stuff like that goes on that.
Yes.
I can't remember the last time I threw, I mean, maybe the odd rotten tomato or something, but we don't waste anything, and I don't think that's true.
Yes, yes.
Because I look in the fridge and think, oh, I've got a bit of that over, I'll use that in, like I made salad yesterday, well, we had it for lunch today, you know, that sort of thing. Yeah, and I don't know that people do that very much these days.
So like final thoughts, any kinds of advice or guidance, or anything that you might think is inspiring for our listeners?
Oh, that's a big question. I think one of the things is that very often less is more. That you can enjoy things, but maybe less often. You know, it's not good for us to eat lots of biscuits, but enjoy it now and again. So you know, make a cake sometimes, but you know, don't have cake in the house all the time. You know, so I think it is about, I think it's about actually the quality of life, and enjoying things, and not expecting to have things all the time. And I think that we appreciate things much more if we do that.
So Roberta, thank you very much for your time and all your wisdom. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Raji.
Okay.
Bye
Okay,
then.
bye for now.